Thank you for being here. Well, first off, my name is Spencer Schecht. I'm Senior Business Development Lead for the Americas here at the Global CCS Institute. And fans and enthusiasts might remember that this event used to be called the DC Forum. Commiserate with the increased interest and deployment of CCS across the continent, we are now here today at the Americas Forum. So, as such, we have a fantastic panel for you of regulatory updates from 4 US states and 1 Canadian province. So come on up here, Julie. So, as Jared mentioned earlier, with this increasing interest and leadership, incentives and policies on the federal level, both in the United States and Canada, there's been a shift of interest to a regional level, to states and provinces to lead CCS deployment. So I think we have just about everyone. And it is worth noting, I am the only male on this panel, which of course presents a fantastic opportunity for a playful and appropriate joke that I will not make.
Okay.
So, our panel, we have Kate Rich, Assistant Deputy Minister, Policy, Alberta Environment and Protected Areas from the Government of Canada. I'm sorry, the Government of Alberta in Canada. California, we have Natalie Lee, Assistant Division Chief at California Air Resource Board. There's Julie Murphy. She is Director at Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission, Colorado Department of Natural Resources. Jessica Moore, State Geologist and Director of the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey. Holly Kretka, Executive Director at the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. So the way this is going to work is each panelist will take between 8 and 10 minutes to present, and then we will have a question and answer panel discussion at the end. So do yourself a favor. If you have questions, write that down and save it till the end. That's when the question and answer piece will take place. So great, we have all of our panelists on stage here. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists as well as Kate to the lectern.
I think to advance. Okay. Oh, there we go. I'll just skip right ahead. So good morning, and thank you to the Institute for inviting Alberta here. Alberta, if you don't know, is north of Montana. It covers a relatively large area, about 1.5 times the size of California. We've got mountains, we've got prairies, we've got boreal forest, we've got grasslands, and coupled with abundant natural resources. So I'm going to speak really quickly about our geological potential for CCS, the incentives that we have, the drivers that we have that are actually incenting it beyond direct investments by government, and a little bit on the regulatory framework and progress to date. So thank you very much to the International CCS Knowledge Center, and we have Beth Hardy-Valiaho here. She asked a question in the last panel, and this is a slide that we've taken from them. And it's really meant to show that frankly, not just Alberta, but I am here to focus on Alberta, has excellent geological storage potential for carbon dioxide. We've got an estimated capacity of about 78 gigatons in deep saline aquifer storage. But coupled with that, it's not just about knowing your geology. We do have an abundant number of geologists in our province because of our natural resource development. But we do have a relatively long-established regulatory system when it comes to carbon capture and storage. And we're one of the few jurisdictions that has that regulatory system coupled with a strong knowledge of its geology and knowing that it's ready for CO2 storage, and it's enough to get us to carbon neutrality by 2050. So you can imagine how much our government has a robust policy frame across our energy department, our energy regulator, our environment departments, our technology departments, all focused on how to enable CCS. We've got over a decade of monitoring and watching to commercial scale projects, CCS in action, that we can safely show the safe and long-term storage. This map, as I say, shows all of Western Canada. If you don't know, the dots on it are the emission sources. We're We have very few people in Alberta, but a lot of industry, a lot of industrial development. So we're lucky that our storage and our sources are matched there. So about the incentives, I recognize we're in the United States and using, frankly, we hear all the time about all the incentives that the Americans get for CCS. So maybe it's a bit of talking about what the play is in Alberta and in Canada. Our main driver in Alberta is actually our carbon pricing system. We have the longest standing industrial carbon pricing and emissions trading system in North America. We started in 2007. We had 3 years of looking at our emissions and reporting those. So we started that in 2004, but our pricing started in 2007. And now we have a current carbon price of $80 per ton Canadian. It rises by $15 per year to $170 per ton in 2030. Now still, most folks looking at CCS now would like to know the price in 2031, 2032, and 2033, and we are working on that. We do have an interim review in 2026 on our policies to try to get ahead on that. Second piece is we have a federal CCS investment tax credit. 50% of all eligible capital costs in Canada will be covered prior to 2031 as a refundable tax credit. We also have the federal clean fuel regulations. So like our provincial carbon pricing program, you can use CCS is an eligible credit for some activity types, and those credits are stackable. You can use them in our carbon pricing system, and you can use them in the federal clean fuel standards. Our federal government has an arm's length investment agency called the Canada Growth Fund that's advancing contracts for difference or offtake agreements, where one of the first agreements for CCS was just enabled in December of 2023 at a price of 86.50 Canadian per ton. We have a new investment program in Alberta to complement the federal investment tax credit. It's called the Alberta Carbon Capture Incentive Program. It's a 12% coverage of eligible capital costs for facilities to incorporate CCS into their operations. This is funded in part by industrial carbon pricing, but other pieces as well. And then we also do a big link for hydrogen and CCS. We recognize we are one of the largest hydrogen producers in the world. We want to continue to produce hydrogen, and we want it to be clean with CCS. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this side. This is just our carbon pricing slide. I think I've gone over the main points. It's an emissions intensity-based approach that gets tighter over time, so there's an incentive for those investments, and our carbon price is increasing relatively steeply. So now to get to kind of our carbon offset side of our emissions trading system. As I say, we do allow emissions trading, we do allow offsets, and those are for CCS as well as enhanced oil recovery. So our offset system provides regulated facilities that flexibility in how they want to meet their compliance obligations. But they have to follow government-approved protocols with very specific measurement and calculation and reporting requirements. And they have to ensure additionality and permanence of that reduction. So we've got about 18 protocols. As I say, we do have one for CCS, and we do have one for EOR. And generally, we look at how many reductions are achieved minus what it took to transport, as well as other emissions that are associated with CCS development. So it is the delta between them. We do provide some assurances for potentially unintentional releases. So our EOR protocol applies a 0.5% discount factor and a holdback of 2%. That holdback is returnable at post-closure. And we do look at the liability for CO2 stays with that CCS project, but now we are actually always looking at these protocols to say if they have the right policy frame for us. Everything is transparent, our registries, et cetera. So when we look at the subsurface and our tenure and our measurement and verification systems, this is long established in Alberta, whether it's under our carbon pricing system, whether it's under our CCS regulatory system. But we want to be clear that our regulatory framework for assessment was advanced in 2011, so relatively mature for most other jurisdictions when it comes to CCS. And we brought folks from around the world to help develop this framework. We recognized that we were ahead of the game, so we brought people all over to develop this. And the government is the owner of the pore space and assumes the long-term liability with our storage sites, and including the post-closure period. So it does transfer back to government in that period. We have our operators contribute to a post-closure stewardship fund for paying the ongoing monitoring and any required maintenance and remediation. But our 10-year legislation is in place really to help us advance CCS. We're really focused on hubs at the moment and working as a collective, but we do also have our small sites and our remote sites. Just put in a quick picture of all our hubs. We've got 24 hubs that we've actually are looking at evaluation agreements or looking at their potential in Alberta. We've got 6 of those. Those were all bid and proposed in 2022. Those are the first group. Our pore space evaluation agreements have been awarded to operators, so they're drilling wells, they're getting their potential hubs design details in place, and they're getting their MMV plans in place. 6 companies have moved to the next step. They've applied for their carbon sequestration agreement, and they're in negotiation with the Government of Alberta to advance their hubs. Again, long-term liability still comes to us, and we still continue on our small scale. So really what matters is the investment happening. So I'm not going to go backward. We have the Quest project that has been operating since 2015, about 1 megaton per year. We've got the Enhanced Alberta Carbon Trendline project that started in 2020, and it's about a 14 to 15 megaton per year as it scales up. And then we have a small, it's all about different scales. We've got a Glacier gas plant that's capturing about, it's moving from about 12 kilotons to about 30 kilotons per year at a gas plant. Those projects are all in play. But what's coming next, we've got Air Products coming on with a net zero hydrogen manufacturing, and that should be about 3 megatons starting in early 2025. We've got Heidelberg as a first cement facility internationally in late 2026, about 1 megaton per year. We've got Dow ethylene cracker for hydrogen, about 1 megaton per year starting in 2029. Then we've got the Pathways Alliance, which is 6 major oil sands companies by 2030, about 10 to 12 megatons. And those are just some of the projects that we have. Our last bit is our policy challenges like everybody else. We still have policy uncertainty. What's the carbon price? Number one thing we get asked. What will be the carbon price post-2030? We're getting many questions as to whether we will accept imported CO2 for injection in Alberta, something that we're looking at, what framework would be there, and how to better look at labeling and looking at removal credits in parallel with CCS like DAC and BECCS. That was it for Alberta. Lots on the go.
Good morning. I'm going to speak from here. I hope you can all see and hear me. I'm Natalie Lee. I'm from California, from the Air Resources Board. Thank you for the opportunity to join the conversation. California, while we aren't as mature as Alberta in our carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration and our direct removal programs, we are very mature in our climate policies. And so we are developing our carbon removal policies under a broad framework that has been developed largely over the last 2 decades. Driven not just by legislation, but also by directive and executive orders issued by our governors. A key part of the California climate policy is our scoping plan. This was authorized initially in 2006 under Assembly Bill 32, which was really hallmark climate legislation for our state, and directs the Air Resources Board at least every 5 years to provide an updated pathway for accomplishing the state's climate goals across the economy. That climate action plan, our scoping plan, is then translated into action through traditionally a 3-prong approach based on regulations, incentives and technical assistance, and market-based programs, such as our cap and trade program and our low carbon fuel standard. And then there's a myriad of projects resulting from those 3-pillared actions. Critical for the role of CCUS and CDR in California was our 2022 scoping plan update. Under this update, there was a shift in the framework of our climate planning. Traditionally, our scoping plan had looked at emissions reductions in targeted high-emitting sectors as our primary activity. Based on a change in legislation I'll talk about in a minute, our framework changed to one of carbon neutrality, still calling for significant reductions in anthropogenic emissions, but also recognizing that to achieve our long-term climate goals and to reach carbon neutrality, we need a mix of carbon removal as well as reductions. The 22 scoping plan also addressed the role of natural and working lands in a robust policy framework that we had not done so before, and modeled the potential outcomes and contributions from our natural and working lands, but also recognized the engineered opportunities. So the legislation underpinning that latest update to our scoping plan was Assembly Bill 1279, which memorialized previously directed action from our governor to reduce anthropogenic emissions by 85% by 2045 and to reach carbon neutrality on an economy-wide basis in the same time frame. The bill also specifically referenced and required that the Air Resources Board, pardon me, my acronym, CARB, explore the role of engineered and natural carbon removal strategies to achieve these goals, and to develop strategies that support the deployment of engineered solutions. This was partnered at the same time frame. Assembly Bill 1279 was adopted in 2022. Same legislative time frame. Senate Bill 905 was adopted, which calls for the Air Resources Board to also develop a specific CCUS program that supports the development of CCS-US projects, but also provides some standards and regulatory provisions, some permitting streamlining, and also public transparency, and further develops community benefits and protections from CCUS and CDR programs. We're well positioned to start our work on SB 905, building on an existing protocol that was adopted in 2018 for our low carbon fuel standard program that recognizes the role of CCUS and DAC projects and their capacity to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels. And our scoping plan, our legislation all clearly recognize that we need to start taking action today to reach our 2030 and 2045 goals. So on a policy basis in California for carbon dioxide removal, we have additional directives from our governor on top of those legislative requirements. Governor Newsom has called for specific removal targets in 2030 and 2045 as outlined here. And the scoping plan relies on and incorporates those targets. We also recognize that our policy perspectives sit in the federal landscape and in the global landscape. So developing policies and programs that leverage the significant investments that we do have the benefit right now from the federal government. Also looking at federal regulations and how California regulations and programs are going to complement and work well within federal regulatory and compliance structures. And I do want to continue to emphasize that we see a complementary role with our nature-based solutions, and that over time, the two natural and engineered solutions will complement and be able to work together along with our reductions. And I really appreciated the earlier panel and that emphasis on the science behind these policies. California's long-standing standard is that our policies are science and data-driven. And we appreciate and recognize that there is a history of science that we can rely on, even though within our state, some of these policies seem new and the technologies appear new. We can rely on the fact that they aren't, and that there's a track record of proven science to support the efforts that we're planning and the actions that we plan to take. And as stated well in previous presentations, we recognize that we can't get to our ultimate goals just through reduction, that there are hard to abate circumstances and that we need a suite of solutions. So again, as I mentioned, this is a balance of aggressive emissions reductions, looking at the role and the opportunity in our natural and working lands, and the complement of engineered solutions. Specific to our Senate Bill 905 Carbon Capture, Removal, Utilization, and Storage Program. Bit of a mouthful. There are specific requirements for the actions that the Air Resources Board will take, including those regulatory provisions, standard setting, permit streamlining, public transparency, and public engagement. We are at the early stages of implementation, although this was passed in 2022, providing the resources to support the action under the legislation lags behind. We are currently focused on putting in place contracts to evaluate the current landscape of technologies. Separately, we've contracted to evaluate the current permit landscape for the range of projects so that we can better understand what a project developer is facing within our state, what our opportunities are to work with our sister state agencies on streamlining those regulatory and permitting processes. And again, this references some of the public transparency requirements that we are also focused on right now. So really quickly, in the interest of time, I'll just mention that we do have some other financial incentives available within the state, again, to support and advance CCUS and CDR technologies. And fundamentally, we see these technologies complementing and working in parallel along with all of our climate policies on our roadmap, which includes not just addressing our climate imperatives, but also improving local air quality, regional air quality, statewide, national air quality contributions, removing our dependence on fossil fuels, ensuring a robust economy, and protecting and improving the public health of our citizens. That's it.
Thank you. I'm pregnant enough, I'm not going to. Sorry. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you to the Institute for the invitation and the opportunity to engage in this conversation. My name is Julie Murphy. I'm the director of Colorado's Carbon and Energy Management Commission. Akin to some others, I would acknowledge that where Colorado sits and where our opportunities lie, I think are great when we think about carbon sequestration. I'm really grateful for the leadership in our state who have connected both with the state of Wyoming, with the Direct Air Capture MOU, and our partners in Alberta, in terms of making sure that we are having a collective conversation. We understand how to learn from our partners, and also we understand the challenges of features that, for example, do not respect political jurisdictions, right? When we think about linear features, pipelines, transmission lines, when we think about storage, that may cross multiple boundaries. Those are issues that we need to be prepared to address and answer for both our communities and for folks who are looking to invest in these technologies. And so Colorado's taken a strong stance in trying to look at those pieces as well as the regulatory, technical, and financial. As I noted, as I'm going to note now, there's a multi-agency approach within Colorado. Colorado Energy Office is leading more on the finance market questions, and so I'm going to touch on a couple of those points, but they certainly aren't my expertise. We're also closely working with the Colorado Department of Health and Environment, or CDPHE, who is managing our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and understanding what that looks like technically across all sectors within the state. And then my agency, the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission, which is really focused on the technical and regulatory excellence for new projects in this space. We do have a Colorado carbon management roadmap under development. It was passed, it was a legislative requirement coming out of the 2023 legislative session, and is really focused on carbon capture for hard to decarbonize sectors, backup gas power generation, and then direct air capture, or CDR, carbon dioxide removal technologies. In Colorado, we think about CCS as separate from enhanced oil recovery, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. So my organization, the Energy and Carbon Management Commission, or ECMC, transitioned its role July 1st of last year, July 1st of 2023, from being the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, the traditional regulator of the upstream oil and gas sector in Colorado and in many other states. You'll hear about the oil and gas commissions, and broadened out our authority to include the opportunity to pursue primacy for Class 6 or CCS, or carbon sequestration regulation from EPA, deep geothermal for utility scale, generally electricity generation, and also for gas storage, thinking about the intersection between natural gas, hydrogen, and kind of preparing for that future. There were a number of additional studies that were included as directives to my agency in that legislation from 2023 to really help advance the understanding of what Colorado's landscape looks like, what we would need from a regulatory standpoint, and try to help better understand what the questions are from the public and have answers to them. I think that this is a really natural draw on our existing expertise within our organization. I think that my counterpart from Alberta stated it nicely. We understand geology pretty well at the former COGCC. We're redeploying that expertise in different arenas now with CCS, deep geothermal, and gas storage. So again, I covered this. We broadened out what it is that we're doing. So then where are we going? Last year's legislation in Colorado didn't answer some pretty critical questions around pore space ownership, ancillary facilities, et cetera. I'm very pleased to report that between me sending these slides in and last week's end of our legislative session, we were able to pass House Bill 241346, which establishes pore space ownership with a surface owner, which is the tradition in most of the US states. I'm a little bit jealous of the crown ownership. It makes some conversations simpler. It also addressed unitization, right? The opportunity to aggregate property rights to make sure that where the carbon dioxide is going to be stored has the right people at the table to be involved. And then the regulation of ancillary facilities. Again, we want to take a complete look at this. That does not include, obviously, the federal pipelines or pipeline infrastructure that isn't specific to what it is we're doing. We did have a very robust legislative session in Colorado. We had also ozone and production fee bills around upstream oil and gas. We had a renewable siting bill, and we also modified our pooling structures on the upstream oil and gas side, right? So all these pieces fit together in a more comprehensive conversation about where are we going, how are we doing it. Setting aside the legislative pieces just for a moment, the Energy and Carbon Management Commission has a pretty aggressive, I think, regulatory agenda. On the upstream oil and gas side, we're looking at cumulative impacts. We should be finalizing rules on the deep geothermal later this summer. And then we're really targeting Q3, Q4 of the calendar year for a carbon sequestration, carbon capture and sequestration rulemaking. And again, that would set the stage for Colorado to pursue primacy from EPA for Class 6 or carbon sequestration wells. And then again, another closing out the calendar year with an upstream oil and gas related rulemaking. So broadening out now to kind of carbon management in Colorado, we had first in the nation industrial decarbonization rules. We do have some state funding for carbon management. I think it's probably not as impressive as some others out there, but you know, I think we're still kicking past our coverage, if you can forgive a football joke. We, again, are working closely with Colorado and Wyoming. Colorado and Wyoming are working closely together to answer some of these larger questions, I think, that are facing all of us, and hoping to help advance that conversation to move the ball along. And as I noted, the carbon management roadmap required by 2023 legislation, we're looking at rolling that out this fall. For us in Colorado, carbon management is really focused on CCS our agency. We regulate upstream oil and gas development. We understand what enhanced oil recovery is. We know how to regulate it. We've been working with it for a long time. We think of those as slightly different in Colorado, but there's also a space for it. We just have an existing regulatory structure for it. Within the carbon management roadmap, there are quite a few directives, and there's a much broader presentation if anybody's interested. And really looking at what are the state policies around risks and opportunities, infrastructure, which I think to me is like, I would put, 32 gold stars next to that and circle it 75 times, because I think maybe, certainly in Colorado, my observations are, at least within the United States, and I would suggest nationwide, worldwide, we're having a lot of trouble siting infrastructure for any type of facility. And if we can't figure that out, it makes it very difficult to advance any sort of goals. I think that one of the other really key conversations in Colorado is around how do we work with community? And that was the resounding feedback we received in the last 2 legislative sessions around carbon sequestration, around direct air capture, around renewable siting. What are we doing for communities? So I really appreciated Angela's comments around co-benefit reduction, or co-pollutant reductions, and the benefits of carbon capture and sequestration in addition to removing greenhouse gas emissions. Or I think that continues to be one of the most difficult conversations. Colorado, through this journey towards having the authority to pursue Class 6 or primacy from EPA for carbon sequestration wells, has put out a number of different studies. I think the most recent one from February 2024 was something really designed to look at safety. And I think that when I think about the spectrum of literature on carbon sequestration, so much of it is a little bit less accessible to those folks who haven't been working in and around geology, pipelines, and or related industries for a long time. We were trying to kind of hit the sweet spot of bringing in enough technical information to answer the questions, but not so much that it was completely inaccessible. So that I hope that that's a helpful resource to any of you who are kind of looking at how do we have this conversation in community, recognizing we have enhanced oil recovery. We understand that there are other storage projects that have existed for quite a while, and this idea that this is completely novel or completely unsafe is not exactly aligning with what it is we know, but we need to find a different way to certainly talk about it, in my estimation. So with that, I would wrap up my comments and look forward to the ongoing dialogue, and thank you to my panelists, co-panelists.
Hi, good morning. My name is Jessica Moore. I'm the West Virginia State Geologist and Director of the West Virginia Geological Survey. And West Virginia has positioned itself to be an early mover in CCS. And by benefit of being around for a while, I have become the de facto CCS subject matter expert in the state. And so when I love to come and speak in front of an audience like this that knows CCS. And when I do so, I encourage you to look at our state seal through the lens of CCS. Okay, so now the farmer is harvesting for BECCS. Those barrels of oil at the foot of the miner are collected with CO2 EOR. We've got a reservoir model on that sandstone, and nobody is chasing our field crews with those rifles. And that last one is said for a little bit of levity, right? It's a joke, but maybe not so much anymore. If you all saw the print edition of the Washington Post this morning, page 1 above the fold, Montana ranchers concerned with CCS. Big oil has a solution, but people are skeptical. And CCS remains one of those few subjects where people can say, I don't know anything about it, but I don't like it. And that's an acceptable response. So West Virginia has been working for almost 20 years, over 20 years, on CCS. And so I thought I'd give you a little recap, little timeline. And it actually starts in 2003, when the first permit applications were received by the State Department of Environmental Protection for the AEP Mountaineer facility. And so that was permitted by the state as a Class 5 experimental test, because Class 6 didn't exist yet. And so over a period of 8 years, 27,000 tons of CO2 were injected into the Copper Ridge Dolomite, and an additional 10,000 tons into the Rose Run Sandstone. Those were 2 wells. And then the injection ceased in 2011. So for about the next 10 years, and this is why I'm the only one standing, the research continued, but the activity really waned. We did not see a whole lot of interest in coming into the Appalachian Basin and storing CO2. In the meantime, shale gas ramped up, and so that really took the focus in Appalachia. So there was a shift in the regional partnerships, which many state geological surveys were a part of, funded by DOE, to include enhanced recovery in our investigations. So West Virginia did that very gladly, because we have many oil fields that were drilled and abandoned before 1940. So we think we've got a lot of residual oil left over. Battelle, who did the work on the AEP Mountaineer, published their post-injection site closure protocol, and that was published in the peer-reviewed literature. And then at the Geological Survey, we did a full review of our depleted oil and gas fields. And so we have come up with storage resource estimates for all of those fields. Then in 2022, activity really started to pick up, and that started with House Bill 4491. And that clarified a lot of policy within West Virginia. So now pore space ownership is vested with the surface estate and cannot be severed, but it can be leased. Unitization clause is 75%. Long-term liability transfers to the state. House Bill 4491 said 10 years, but you'll find out later that that's been changed. From closure, at which point, if you receive your certificate of completion, the state then takes long-term liability. The surface owner owns their CO2. Then in 2023, just last year, there were 2 bills, Senate Bill 161 and 162. These were companion bills. 161 gave the state authority to acquire property or sell property. And 162 gave the state authority to lease public pore space. And so they have done so. And so we have several state properties that are actively under lease for pore space ownership. We had applied to EPA for Class 6 primacy. That is working its way through. I understand that we are close now to our public comment period. So that was, a big lift on the state side. We revised all of our UIC rules. So we already have primacy for 1 through 5, although Class 4 is not used. And so we have worked very closely with our regional EPA to stand up our UIC program, modernize it, and get it ready for Class 6. And then the DOE announced their Hydrogen Hub awards, and Appalachia received one, the ARCH2 Hydrogen Hub. And so once that was announced, everything suddenly became real, because that's a blue hub. And so a blue hydrogen hub uses methane as the feedstock and requires CO2 to get that clean hydrogen status. And then just this year, our legislative session runs from January to March. So we had a bill, HB 5045, that was our full rules package. We had a bill that clarified rework of horizontal wells for enhanced recovery. So we have a whole fleet of shale gas wells that are aging. They're over a decade old, but the current rules prohibited injection into those wells or rework for CO2 enhanced recovery. So we've now clarified that. House Bill 5045 changed the time period for the certificate of completion for 50 years with possibility of a waiver. And so my understanding is that those waivers, there will be a lot of dialogue, and that it probably will not be 50 years before that certificate of completion is issued. And I can also report that we have our first Class 6 permits that have been submitted to EPA, and that was Tenaska who submitted those, and that's in support of a carbon safe, phase 3 carbon safe. So we're really excited. Things are really moving. But we feel like there's not a lot of information out there, despite our best efforts. I'll talk to anybody about CCS. Not a lot of people are really willing to listen. So we want to get out there early. We want to get out there with the science. And so there's a couple of projects I'm going to talk about. The first one is one that we're standing up with our regulators, and this is the Regional Aquifer Mapping Portal. So what our regulators will do is take a top-down approach, look at underground sources of drinking water. Geological Survey will take a bottoms-up approach, look at deep saline aquifers, and the goal is to meet in the middle at that saltwater-freshwater interface that is so important to characterize for your Class 6 permit. We'll work together on a couple of different fields, that's karst and mine pools. So in Appalachia, we have a lot of mine voids. Many of them are filled with water. And some of that water is actually potable. Some of it is actually acidic and can be recovered. Critical minerals can be recovered. So we've got a little bit of work to do to characterize which are the good ones and which are the bad ones. We also have, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about our efforts on this. This is a funding from the Department of Energy for regional deployment of CCS. And so this is locally tailored stakeholder engagement. And there are several state geological surveys that are involved with this. We are in partnership with Pennsylvania as part of the Central Appalachian Partnership for Carbon Storage. And so we're really going to get into our communities and talk to them about CCS. So this conversation is going to be in 3 parts. When people come in, there's going to be a series of maps. We're going to help show where you're from, where everybody's from in the room, okay? There are going to be some large format visuals. My agency has been an agency in state government for 125 years. I have an incredible historical photo collection. We're going to blow them up. People can learn from that. You know, you can't expect these communities to learn the same way that we're learning here today. It's got to be something different. And we're going to invite them to speak first. So before the scientists come up, before the companies come up, the communities are going to be invited, and they're going to have their own large format visual. You know, and if the Sierra Club wants to come in with a polluted stream visual, maybe it's what people need to see, you know? And then we'll talk about our energy past. All right, this will segue into energy present, where the geologists will set the stage. You know, these are the reservoirs we're looking at. This is the geologic time frame. And we've got a great activity. I have a wonderful paleontologist on staff, and she did not bat an eyelash when I told her I wanted an activity that combined West Virginia paleontology with Pokemon and the Oregon Trail. And so what has emerged from this is an activity called Choose Your Fossil Fighter, where we'll set the stage with the fossils that lived during this time frame. And then our energy future will be when we get the companies come in, and they can present their vision, you know, to these communities and what it will mean to them. And so we have this senator from West Virginia. You may have heard of him, Senator Manchin. And if you ever see him speak in front of a crowd, he'll tell you that West Virginians mined the coal, that forged the steel, that built the ships, that won the war, that onshored peace and domestic prosperity. And we certainly co-sign that. But at the Geological Survey, we call it the rock to cable movement, because no matter how you shake it, every energy source starts with a rock. So, you know, make friends with a geologist, or maybe an ornithologist. You never know. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. And always appreciate our friends in West Virginia. And we have also an incredible state geologic survey, which is right across the parking lot from us. So we rely on them and have a great working relationship. So important. So hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Holly Krecka. I'm Executive Director of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. Really excited to talk to you about what's happening in Wyoming today. I do have some slides. There we go. Okay, so things I wanted to talk about, and by the way, we have our top Class 6 regulator in the room, Lily Barkow. She runs a Class 6 program at our DEQ. Raise your hand, Lily. There she is. Okay, so we thought it'd be fun to send me up here as a chemical engineer to talk about regulatory status in Wyoming. She'll sit back there and be silently judging me and see how I do, but she'll answer all the hard questions if you have any on the regulatory side. And so I'll talk about our role at the School of Energy Resources and the role we play in the state, and also really what's happening in Wyoming, our regulatory approach, which has been set over 20 years. and some different programs we have across the state. We are pretty advanced in it, in moving forward CCUS. So at the School of Energy Resources, really unique entity. We are something of a state lab. So we're very mission driven like the national labs, and our mission is to promote energy driven economic development for Wyoming. We're specifically looking at using Wyoming's mineral and energy wealth to drive incremental revenue for the state. And so that CCUS fits very well in that bucket. And I just wanted to highlight, we have a unique governance structure, which is these folks, our Energy Resources Council, a lot of industry executives from companies operating in the state. And this is how we keep focused on that mission. They're nominated by the governor and confirmed by the state Senate. And we're placed at the University of Wyoming really to leverage all the great minds and cutting edge work happening at the university, but we also have our own internal research team that leads a lot of really applied projects. So that's just a little background on where I'm coming from, because it is a really unique role. And like I said, we are a quasi-state entity working with Lily and her team at DEQ, working with the State Survey, Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, and more. So let's talk about where we are with CCUS in Wyoming. I would say we're in agreement. We're ready to support deployment. And we are actively handing off the baton to industry. So these community meetings that Jessica referenced, those are starting to happen in Wyoming. And where the university, even though we're involved in some of these projects, our role at those meetings is really what you see is a company come in, talk about what they want to do in terms of a CCUS project, and then we're there to talk about the science, the regulation, and really support Wyoming landowners. So we have to be that third-party trusted source, and I'll talk about how we do that in a minute. So we have run something called the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative. So we already have extensive CO2 pipelines in the state of Wyoming that is serving our enhanced oil recovery industry. It's part of the reason Wyoming is, I think, going to be a first mover on deployment of CCS, because we have a longstanding existence of a CO2 pipeline and EOR industry. It's hard for those to be scary when they've already been in our backyard for decades. We also have a very friendly regulatory framework that I'll go through, and we have primacy for Class 6 permitting, which again, Lily is in charge of, and her team. We have great CO2 storage. We've assessed capacity for over 26 billion tons of CO2. We have a lot more work to do to look at the rest of the state. We have something called the Wyoming Integrated Test Center, which is a technology neutral site where technology vendors can test their technology. So on the capture and use side, so we have two associated with those Carbon Safe projects. And for those not familiar, Carbon Safe is a Department of Energy program in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. It's for these large projects designed to eventually create CO2 storage hubs. We've had one, Wyoming Carbon Safe, operating adjacent to Basin Electric's Dry Fork Power Plant that started in about 2016. As part of that program, we have 2 wells drilled and completed to Class 6 standards. We've done subsurface testing. They're not permitted Class 6 yet because we had to get that Class 1 permit to do the tests. We also have 3 Class 6 permits issued, and that was to our partner in a different Carbon Safe project, the Sweetwater Carbon Storage Hub. So really the two, well, one active and one hopefully will be active soon. The 2 Carbon Safe projects are kind of on the brackets of the state. One's in the Northeast, one's in the Southwest, and that CO2 pipeline runs in between. So in terms of a regulatory update, Wyoming was one of the first states, although we love to copy our friends in North Dakota, but we were one of the first to specify who owns a pore space, and it is, again, it is the surface owner. I think it's important, one comment that I heard, I know it might be easier if the government owned it like they did in Alberta. However, this really gets the public involved, and it creates a natural income stream for our landowners. So we haven't seen the opposition to CCS yet, knock on wood, that has been seen elsewhere. And I think this is part of one of the reasons why is, you know, and this is a spoiler alert, I was going to talk about this later, but now at these community meetings, one of the things we're seeing is it's really landowners, they get it. Like, they've been doing mineral development on their land for a long time. They want to understand the actual geology. So how is this going to impact my water? How is this going to impact mineral development? But then the question we're getting more and more is, how do I know I'm getting a fair value for my pore space? And they don't, because it is such an early stage of development. Now, we have really responsible developers in Wyoming, like Frontier Carbon Solutions, who have actually offered to come back because they don't really know either, and everyone's doing their best. But if a landowner is offered less for their pore space than their neighbors, then that company will come back and reimburse them, or change the contract actually to reflect the going rate for pore space leasing. So anyway, okay, I have to really speed up. But I just gave about half my talk in that little speech. So we have post-closure MRV, unitization of storage interests, which is 80%. So one of the things you'll see, we're pro-CCS, but we are pro-landowner in Wyoming, and that is never going to go away. We have, of course, dealt with incidentally stored CO2 from enhanced oil recovery. We actually have a low carbon energy standard requiring CCS. So this is very different. It's called House Bill 200. We just extended the deadline for that to be closer to what the EPA just put in place at the national level. But this is one thing, if you take away one thing from this talk, sometimes when you hear about CCS globally, or even nationally, it's like the thing you do last, right? We're gonna go get emissions that we can't get from anywhere else, any other option. That's not our sentiment in Wyoming. This is really the thing we're looking at first, because it's providing revenue to communities, it's supporting our legacy industries that are the foundation of our economy, and it's keeping our energy communities whole. So we just have a really different perspective. And also, when you think about the land footprint of CCS and nuclear, it's a lot smaller than other low carbon options. And that's something that is really valued in a state like Wyoming, where we actually do have a lot of untouched land, and we want to keep it that way. So I'm going to keep going. So I mentioned the test center, the integrated test center. We have 4 carbon safe projects that we have been selected for. Only one of these is active right now. We haven't been able to get the contracts in place for the others yet, but Dry Fork is associated with one of the newest coal-fired power plants in the country. That's Wyoming Carbon Safe. That is the name. That is the plant, is Dry Fork. I just want to say that's the other thing that's probably a little different, is that in the context of the US and North America, I will talk about coal. And we see this as, Dry Fork is really important. We have Laramie River Station. It's one of the few power plants that sits on both the western and eastern interconnect. That plant needs to stay operating. So we are still working on, and really think that there's an important tie to adding CCS to coal plants. So I'll keep going, but the only other thing I'd point out is that we have a project in Oregon as well. So School of Energy Resources, we're really interested in engaging with stakeholders outside the state. We export over 90% of our energy from Wyoming. So we're happy to engage in projects since we have a lot of expertise on CCS. So a lot of work has been done on Wyoming Carbon Safe for about 8 years now. That's adjacent to Basin Electric's Dry Fork Power Plant. We have our EA, we closed public comment for our EA on Carbon Safe. We had no negative comments, none. We had some challenging ones, some technical ones, but nothing against the project. So that just shows you where we are. In terms of social license, I'll tell you that unabated energy industry still is the most popular in Wyoming. But when you look to our energy, and this is a graph, and I know the legend is very small, but the first one is oil and natural gas-based electricity generation. And the last on the right is carbon capture and storage. This is a statewide survey. If you narrow down to our energy communities, you can see that actually CCUS is the most popular low carbon energy choice in the state of Wyoming. So that was 74%. So the other thing I just wanted to point out, things that we're working on, we have what every Wyoming landowner should know about carbon capture and storage. We're creating one on pipelines too. So I I'm getting the hook here. So the last thing I wanted to say was this has one of the ways that we sell this CCUS to our communities. We don't sell it, actually. We just put out these studies. There is a huge financial benefit to our communities beyond just keeping our existing industries open. This in its own right is a big economic development opportunity for the state of Wyoming. And one of the things you'll hear about in Wyoming is a brain drain. We have our graduates leaving the state from the University of Wyoming, but at the School of Energy Resources, about 77% of our graduates are UW, or our employees are UW graduates, and between a third and half of those are Wyoming natives. That's hard for anywhere else to get these kind of like high-tech, high-paying jobs, and the CCS industry and at the School of Energy Resources and our partners across the state is accomplishing that. So that is all I have. Thank you.
10 minutes goes faster than you think.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to our panelists. And now we'll transition to the question and answer portion. We do have some mics running around here, but I'll take moderator privilege and ask the first question. Kate, coming back to you, can you explain just a little bit more on what makes Alberta such a unique place to do CCS and maybe in regards to some of the other Canadian provinces?
Sure, thanks. So other Canadian provinces also would have crown ownership, so slightly different in Canada. Whether it makes things easier or harder, I'm not sure, but it does make access, we think, generally easier. Our established regulatory framework is unique in Canada. Others are now coming to Alberta often to ask us how we set up a regulatory framework. Our long-term liability management. So our geological knowledge, our regulatory framework, very much like our 10-year process for anything you're taking out of the ground, is comparable to putting it back in, right? We use our knowledge for one to do the other. Our carbon pricing has been driving this for some time, and our knowledge and frankly our commitment to CCUS was very early in the game. I was working, I think, in oil sands development at the time, and this was back in 2007, where our premier put out a $4 billion fund for CCS. It was so far ahead that only 2 projects, we only spent half of that or less because people weren't ready for it yet. But that's how far ahead the tech groups were thinking to say we need something really big. And as I say, carbon pricing has been with us. We're an export economy that certainly recognizes that green is part of that. It's really important to have those sustainable products. So whether we're selling oil and gas, hydrogen, methanol, ammonia, like whatever we're selling, we want to make sure it's green. And so for us, CCUS has been a really, really long-term piece for us. I do look at our incentive programs as slightly higher than other provinces. But really, I would fundamentally say what the number one thing we hear is it's a clear regulatory framework.
Thank you so much. Now, also, do our panelists have questions for each other right now? Just wanted to present that opportunity. Okay, questions from the audience. Please raise your hand and we'll have a mic right here in the middle.
Thank you, Sam Bowers from CATF, Clean Air Task Force. I have a question for Assistant Deputy Minister Rich on the Capital Power project that was recently kind of put on pause. So I'm wondering, kind of, is the province considering additional policy support, like OPEX support, and do you think the project is feasible at a higher carbon price? Thank you.
So maybe for those of you that may or may not know, Capital Power is an electricity utility that operates in the United States as well as Canada. And it recently, I think it was last week, maybe the week before, has announced that it's put its CCUS project on hold. This is for its plant where it didn't just do it didn't do a conversion from coal to nat gas, it did an entire repurposing of its plant to natural gas, which is far more expensive than than just a typical conversion. And it's decided to put on pause its CCS project that would have generated about 3 more megatons per year in addition to its conversion. We're disappointed, obviously, in that, but we certainly recognize we are using this as a bit of a time to say what's happening and working, frankly, with the federal government and others to say what are the investments needed here. Our electricity market is more like many American markets here in that it's competitive, but affordability matters a heck of a lot when it comes to electricity. So every cent that it puts into a cost is something that would get scrutinized in Alberta as well in the electricity market at the moment. So we are looking to say what was needed and learn from that. We have been speaking with other companies. They're less deterred. It really is that long-term price and that stability that most folks are looking for in our markets, both our carbon pricing market and the federal clean fuel regulation market, which is comparable to California using the 2 tools in its toolbox.
Thank you so much. Question down in front.
Hi, Chris Gregg from Princeton. I'm interested in this trend of increasing the duration of the long-term liability and what you think that will do and what you're hearing from investors. When I've tried to do CCS when it was first cool 20 years ago, we fought really hard for a 15-year cap. We really felt that the private sector would struggle with anything that was 50 to 100 years. And yet I'm seeing that trend in the US, and I'm just fascinating to hear whether you're getting some pushback on that. And I was multitasking and I missed Alberta, but yours is not that long.
Ours is shorter. It's not necessarily an explicit number. I want to be really fair about that, to say we all recognize when we write new regulations, we have to see what they produce. So it is based on the monitoring, the MMV program itself. So I want to be really clear about that. But we're probably thinking in the 10+ year range, not in a 50-year range. It doesn't mean that the monitoring doesn't continue post-closure. It's the post-closure liability transfer.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, I think the others is 50 years.
We're at 20. Well, you can apply 20 years after you stop injection to transfer the long-term stewardship is the words we use, not liability, but yeah, so we're at 20. I actually think, I think North Dakota is at 10, and it wasn't really from inside the state, but I wouldn't say, I think it was more a political push to extend that out rather than anything technical.
I got a lot of calls when West Virginia changed theirs to 50. There was some concern on the state side because the state does take that long-term liability that maybe we didn't understand as much. So I don't think they were, completely opposed to it. But I did have to go and check the last floor amendment to make sure that it hadn't been struck at the last minute because it was just in this last session. What I've heard from the regulators is they would like to have, same as Wyoming, an ongoing conversation with strong review points at 5 years and 10 years. And they anticipate that the waivers will be granted, around that point. But just for uncertainty, that's why the 50 years was changed.
I have to say, we're on the other end, arguably, although not fully defined for purposes of project development. But within our low carbon fuel standard, our permanence requirement is 100 years and has certainly, met with comment and concern regarding the economic viability and really the practical, capacity to monitor and maintain either on the regulatory sense or on the operation sense over that period of time. So I think as we seek under that Senate Bill 905 structure to establish standards for operations as well as M&V, that's going to be a robust part of the conversation. So I appreciate it and can only speak to our one existing requirement, which is clearly on the on the other end of the spectrum.
If I can chime in, I think Colorado's kind of in the middle of all of these conversations. I think that there's a mix of issues bound up in it. One is, how long is the injector responsible? And then when does the state provide opportunity, should there not be a company anymore, right? And so we've had a lot of conversations in the upstream oil and gas space around orphan wells. And so I think you're actually balancing two different things in these conversations. And I think that the idea that so long as the injector is a viable company, they are first looked to makes sense with many of our other expectations of industries across the sector. But when is the state also going to step in and support if there is an incident, to help our communities know that there is a long-term support and answer, and they're not going to be left holding the bag should there be an incident? I think that's at the crux of the Colorado conversation right now.
Other questions? See one here. Oh, and over here.
Hi, I'm Siri Hedreen. I'm a reporter with S&P Global. My question is for states with primacy or pursuing primacy. I guess say carbon capture ramps up according to plan, as in like the industry deploys according to plan. How many, just like trying to get a sense of how ubiquitous Class 6 wells would be. So like how many permits would you expect to need to issue a year? And how many, like how much more resources would that require at the state level to permit and implement all this?
I don't have a perfect answer.
We have privacy. And actually, Lily is the perfect person to answer that. So because she's the one reviewing permits. So, but I would point out that one of the advantages, primacy gives you the opportunity to control how much resources you put in to that permitting process. And so, am I allowed to call a friend on that? Yeah. In terms of, or you should just connect with her on number of permits. I know we have 3 that were just permitted not too long ago, and then we're preparing 10 applications ourselves. But there's a lot of projects moving around the state, and the question is when, not how, not if, but when.
West Virginia is pursuing primacy and are very advanced in those discussions with EPA. And this is a topic that I think a lot about, because my agency are the subsurface mappers. We are non-regulatory, so what we have done is establish a memorandum of agreement with our regulators that we will consume the geocellular models that operators submit with their permits. We will review those independently, and we already do this for Class 2 enhanced recovery wells. And so we feel like we're prepared. We certainly have the training and expertise, but we don't have a very deep bench. And so if we get a lot of these permits at once, it would be a strain on resources, I think.
I think the other thing I'd add is the DOE had a really good program that's just kicking off now that's actually funding a collaboration between School of Energy Resources, the state DEQ, and then the State Geologic Survey, where we have the opportunity to kind of streamline the Class 6 process in terms of providing data for geologic data that's already been vetted, and then making that more easily available to project developers so that they can go and use resources that's already been reviewed by the DEQ, and that way that they're not bringing totally new information to the table. So that's a really good program that's just kicking off now.
I think that's huge too. Having those pre-competitive data sets available, lowering those technical barriers to entry for people trying to come in. I think that's what organizations like ours can do.
And I think from Colorado, we built this program into an existing regulatory structure to be able to capitalize on known expertise. Colorado has a Class 2 program that it's been administering. So we're redeploying existing state resources. I think there's also opportunities in the way that the primacy program is structured to rely on third-party experts to provide some of that deeply scientific information so that we can take a relatively conservative staffing approach. And so as we compare it to kind of existing oil and gas well permitting in Colorado, we're permitting roughly, 1,000 oil and gas wells a year. We're seeing a few handful, 10-ish kind of carbon sequestration permits coming into EPA or hearing about them. And so in terms of scale, we have the opportunity to scale up as the industry needs it, I think, and the tools in place and the expertise in place to do so.
Yeah, and I really don't have a lot to add from the California specific perspective, except, I think it's an interesting question to think about, the alternative and the responsiveness and adaptability of the federal government to equally address uptake and what could be, some trade-off decisions there or some trade-off considerations into states' flexibility with good regulatory structures in place that are just adapting to handle, additional workload. So, yeah.
So I saw some hands in the back. Yes. Do you have a microphone?
My name is Sheda. I'm from Pepperdine University. First of all, very refreshing to see an all-woman panel. So I just want to highlight that. We've seen several models here, and it's very interesting and also inspiring what's happening in different states. Initially, when we started talking about decarbonization and reaching net zero, we were looking at different models. One of the models that emerges is the cap and trade model, and this is a technology which is the carbon storage. How do you see kind of these two kind of approaches intersect or kind of conflict with each other, especially if we want to put an incentive for us to decrease carbon versus we see here a lot of community benefits that happen with the whole carbon storage investment and the pricing of the land. So I just want to see if anybody has any thoughts on that.
So I think I'll lead, since California's cap and trade program, certainly has considered how a suite of policies will complement each other. And fundamentally, California's cap and trade program is a climate program, not an economic program. It has certainly resulted in some strong economic benefits for the state and opportunities for local benefit return, but it is a climate program. And so we have already signaled through the low carbon fuel standard that the introduction of carbon capture and sequestration and removal crediting would result in compliance reductions for those entities that are attributed with and allocated the benefit from investing in and installing carbon capture. So we've already sent that signal that that is what we see in the future. Of course, our regulations and our programs will have to be updated as our carbon capture and sequestration programs are advanced and further developed. But we also, to speak to kind of the community benefits element of that, where cap and trade, our cap and trade program has certainly provided for that. We also anticipate that our carbon capture and carbon removal projects will provide the same. We want to provide a framework where these projects are not just protecting environments, but they are establishing a system to provide benefit to the communities around these projects. So, long term, I think they'll complement each other well. They will accelerate our ultimate goals, which are to address the climate crisis, and can work in a complementary way to ensure reinvestment in communities.
I think I saw a hand farther closer to the stage here. Do you want to ask a question? Yes. Oh, sure.
Do you expect or anticipate CCS to be included in cap and trade?
So I don't think that microphone's on, but the question was, do you expect to see CCS included in cap and trade?
Will cap and trade adapt to appropriately reflect? Yes, we do see that. Of course, you know, you're talking about different suites of regulations and programs, so, and they're not developing temporarily, you know, in parallel. So we've already put out initial documentation about a pending update to our cap and trade regulation, and so, you know, we'll have to strategically update to align programs over time. But yes, I absolutely see the two working together in the future.
Hi, Chris White from Nuxen. We are a direct air capture company, and I think it's already 12:05, so I'll make this a speed round. Which of your regions is most suitable for direct air capture now and in the future? Yes, Alberta wins. Time for lunch.
I'm not even joking. It's because, I mean, we're really trying to be technology agnostic. And I should note, like, we've got some folks in here that would know that we use some of our carbon pricing revenue early on to actually invest in direct air capture. That would have been 15, 20 years ago, to start to advance this in Canada and start to advance some technologies there. Because it's very rare, but we don't like to pick winners and losers, but we really do like to say if something's promising, we want to see it funded, and we want to take some risks. Like I said, we had $4 billion up, gosh, almost 20 years ago on CCS. Like, that's putting your neck out, and there's the same on direct air capture. It wasn't quite the same amount of money. But why I say that is because we're already thinking about our regulatory frame for CCS is readily adapted for any technological type removal. We look at CO2 is just CO2. That's all it is to us. So we are looking to say, how do we fund these things as well? And recognizing that we use carbon pricing as our prime basis. So like California says, how does it adapt in? For us, a requirement is in Canada that we have to have a supply of balance, and we have to balance our supply and demand of credits in order to maintain a carbon price signal. That helps reduce the policy layers that you have to put on there. So a lot of it is, what's the price and stringency of our system going to be to drive those things like DAC? We've got a lot of DAC folks coming in saying, we're ready, can you help us get a site? And it's really marrying two together. I would argue we are very ready for these types of technologies to be adopted.
I think our policy framework supports the development, but I think there's some critical questions and I hate to use the word challenges, but like conversations that need to happen around how we can integrate these technologies into our existing energy systems with competing demands and, you know, some already stressed systems and infrastructure. So, you know, I think that's a critical conversation that would accelerate California's readiness.
We have an operating direct air capture facility, and I think maybe two now, and Colorado's looking at that opportunity as part of our carbon management future.
Same for West Virginia. We certainly have a lot of point sources, but it's just one facet that we're evaluating.
And I would say, okay, our big disadvantage in Wyoming is our altitude from the chemical engineering standpoint. You have a lower driving force. Obviously, we have the regulatory framework. Our MOU is specifically, with Colorado specifically, touches on direct air capture. We're long on power. We have the electricity, but it's 75% coal-fired. And our friends on the West Coast need it to keep their lights on. So it's a good question. I think, you know, that's the big question around DEC is, where is that energy going to come from? So, and we do have, you know, the largest wind facility onshore in North America being built. It is 17 years in the making so far due to permitting and challenges with agreements on the transmission side. So, you know, that infrastructure of providing that level of energy, it's not going to happen overnight. So.
Great question to instigate a little DAC arms race. So we have time for one more quick question right here.
Thank you. Martha Ramos from CMEX. And thank you so much to the panelists. It's been very informative. So I have a question for Natalie in California. So the regulation requires the industrial sector, and let's say cement specifically, to be net zero by 2045. So given how cement is, we have no option than utilizing CCUS. So once we build these projects, we're going to have a massive amount of cost that highly unlikely, or as it is right now, we cannot pass it to the end user. But let's say that the only option is to pass it to the end user. How is California going to protect the local industry from cement that is going to come in from neighboring states at a lower cost potentially that do not have CCUS, that is not net zero cement, versus us being in the state and having to have a higher price due to the CCUS project?
Complicated question. First, I do want to make clear that our net zero, our carbon neutrality goals are economy-wide. So there is a recognition that it's not a requirement of every single sector, right? That there is a recognition of that some sectors are going to have emissions to be abated. The exact mechanisms, I think we have a history in the state. I referenced that there are really kind of three pillars that we look at, and they are incentive. There is the incentive role, complementing the regulatory role, and market-based solutions. And in our market-based programs, we have a history of watching for industrial leakage as well as emissions leakage, and providing transition assistance through those market mechanisms to keep our competition favorable with our accelerated climate goals and responsibility. So I can't tell you the exact mechanisms, but I know that right now we are undertaking completion of a study on improving the emissions, decarbonizing the cement industry specifically. And I think the continuing conversation from after the result of that report is going to be, not just the technology advancements that are needed, but the market conditions that need to be supported. So don't have a specific answer, just a commitment to continue the conversation.